All right, so I am excited to have this evening session of talking about contemporary Southern Gothic in literature. And I wanted to give you a sense of what inspired this and the framework I'm working with, and then talk about the two authors I'm focusing on. I think this will be a much bigger project. I think with more authors, more works, I'm feeling a book will come from this. So I'm giving you just a snippet of what I've been working on for some time now. So one of the things that inspired me most in putting together this idea of what does it mean for us to have a contemporary Southern Gothic, I had been reading this text, and I will give reminders of names and texts and all of those things if people would like that information during question time. This book called Undead Souths, and it talks about the presence of, things that we think of as undead, zombies, things of that nature in Southern media of all sorts. But it also talks about how we need to re-envision this idea of the Southern Gothic. So when we think about traditional Southern Gothic, we think about, I think like an Edgar Allan Poe. There's these monolithic things going on where South and Gothic are these entities, and they almost become interchangeable, and as though there's an exceptionalism to them. That this Gothic just naturally occurs in the South, that we're spookier than other regions of the U.S. evidently. And the authors in the introduction to this text talked about this idea of threadbare tropes, and I think they're definitely a little weary of these typical Southern Gothic motifs, themes, elements that we have seen for so many years. And just to give you a little bit of a checklist, we've got haunted houses, evil villains, ghosts, gloomy landscapes, madness, terror, suspense, horror, tangled genealogies, subterranean flights, incest, doubles, and supernatural incursions. So those are some of the elements they point to in this typical Southern Gothic. And the idea that they are running with, that I heartily agree, and I found a framework that I feel like really pushes this forward, is we need to honor the Southern Gothic of the past and acknowledge that it contributed heavily to literature and still permeates so much of our media today. But we also need to push forward and find more complicated, even contradictory characteristics of the Southern Gothic and complicate these terms, take down the monolith, so to speak. So if we're looking at contemporary Southern Gothic, and we're getting out of this escapist sense of what the Gothic is, this fantastical. You're not going into this other world, this fantasy land. This is part of real life. And their argument, and I would definitely agree, is that there's something about Southern literature that has this dark thread. Southern media, they mention fully, but literature in particular has this dark thread that runs through it, where we see in these communities, or we see in these individuals' lives, this underlying sense of doom or decay. And I think the idea is we can keep interrogating that to show how these pieces tie into social and political significance, not just, again, this escapism into a fantasy or supernatural world. So being inspired by that, I also pulled from the same text, Undead Souths, an essay from Elsa Charlety, and the last name is spelled Charlety. I'm using her ideas, and I'm also using ideas from another theorist, Kathleen Brogan, to create my framework to look at and create this idea of a contemporary Southern Gothic. So Charlety, her piece is actually on 1930s Gothic anomalies or outliers. Her argument is that authors such as Faulkner and Erskine Caldwell actually departed from the typical Gothic characteristics because they had two things that were occurring in their works. One was extreme materiality. So this idea that there's these abnormal bodies that are seen as such because they are injured, they're sick, they're deformed, and these bodies speak where words fail. So they punctuate social insecurity, racial tension, and historical wounds. And she also mentioned that in these outliers of the Southern Gothic, that we have haunting happening in the realm of language. So the words themselves have this sense of the dead speaking through them. One of the things I loved most about what she said with the outliers of Southern Gothic fiction is that in these works, fear is tackled in a visceral, carnal way, displaying with outrageous directness a parade of marginals whose presence confronted the South with its moral contradictions and social tensions. And I think that just fits perfectly with the aim of the Southern Gothic, the outliers of the 30s pushing through to the people who are honoring the past while trying to move forward today. So Charlotte was definitely informing my framework. Kathleen Brogan is the other theorist I'm referring to, and her essay is titled American Stories of Cultural Haunting. She's focusing in particular on contemporary African American literature, and she uses the term cultural haunting. So instead of these hauntings being what she calls hallucinatory projections of the individual, hauntings affect the community in which the haunting takes place. And she talks about the fact that there are positive and negative hauntings. So when there's a positive haunting, if there's a person who is interacting in a healthy way with typically a ghost, she talks about demons as well, but I don't know that she would argue that there's a healthy interaction with those. So when people are interacting in this healthy way with the supernatural, they're able to reconcile the past that this ghostly presence represents and pull it together with their future and, move forward in their lives. Negative hauntings, though, would occur when someone is in denial of what the haunting means. And for Brogan, she's arguing that a haunting is almost this traumatic residue of a community, that the violence that has happened in the past, the degradation, the oppression, or these things that are continuing in community, the haunting is the residue of those things happening. And so if we can't reconcile that past and understand it and expose it, then the person who's being haunted in the community itself, I think, stays in this traumatic limbo, so to speak. So I was taking Brogan and taking Charlotte together to address with the two authors I'm going to be talking about today, the fact that we have in contemporary Southern Gothic literature these injured, sick, oppressed bodies, haunted language, and these issues speak not just to individual crises, but the crises of a community. So the personal becomes the collective with these works. And they're using the dead to, bridge this gap between the individual and the collective. So my two authors that I'm focusing on are Natasha Trewethey and Randall Keenan. And I wanted to give you a little bit of information on the two of them in case you're not familiar with their work. I would highly recommend, if not for even the Gothic element, just the pure pleasure of reading their pieces. So Natasha Trewethey, I'm working with her collected volume of poetry titled Monument. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner, former poet laureate, and has several volumes of poetry. She is most known for Native Guard, which talked about Black Civil War soldiers that no one had known existed for some time. They'd been erased from the record. She has volumes titled Domestic Work, Thrall, and Bellix Ophelia are her most noted volumes. And so Monument takes a selection from each of those, but then introduces some new works. And I like this as a go-to because if you want to understand Trewethey and the trajectory of her work, this is absolutely where to start. Everything you need to know about her thematic elements and just the way she uses form is very well expressed here. With Randall Keenan, I'm going to go back a little bit more about what they are in terms of the Gothic, but I wanted to give you just who they were initially. So Randall Keenan was a novelist and short story writer. He unfortunately passed away last year. His most noted novel is A Visitation of Spirits, and it follows the tragic fate of a young gay Black man in North Carolina who realizes that his insular evangelical community will eject him for who he is. And this work and all of Kenan's others, take place in the fictional town of Timms Creek, North Carolina. It's this insular evangelical community. The church is everything. So as you can imagine, people who don't fit with certain ideologies are typically not welcomed or told to suppress themselves. The work I'm focusing mostly on today is his short story collection, Let the Dead Bury Their Dead. And this is a cycle of stories that cover various characters in Timms Creek, Black and white, and I'll discuss what some of the things that link these characters are. His most recent work, published right before he died, was If I Had Two Wings, and I'm planning on incorporating that later on in the work I'm doing. So to talk about their relationship with the Gothic briefly before I delve into these close readings of what they're doing, Trewethey has never been labeled as Gothic. People talk about her in so many ways, but I feel like there's an absence of scholarship on that element in her work. And I'm hoping to publish on this before someone else figures out that this is what is an earmark of her work. So I feel as though she fits perfectly with this Southern Gothic aesthetic, this new or this contemporary version, because her work really centers on haunted language. She is channeling the voices of these long dead people who would be lost to history otherwise, workers of all sorts, maids, sex workers, hairdressers, people whose lives you could argue quite ordinary, but they mean something to their societies, they mean something to their families, and they mean something to her. She also includes really vivid depictions of violence done to bodies. When she's describing impoverished people or she's describing her mother, she mentions bullet holes in heads, shattered fingers, broken bones, these things that are easy to flinch from. But she's trying to indicate that these elements of violence point to larger senses of oppression in a culture that's been going on for a long, long time. So I felt like she fit perfectly with the Gothic, the haunted language, these injured, sick, brutalized bodies. And Kenan, he's long been talked about as Gothic in a sense, but not maybe in this way. I think that people address some of those traditional motifs with his work, but I feel as though the way that he is dealing with the Gothic is maybe a little bit more in fitting with Brogan's view, some of Charlotte's as well. We do have some bodies that have been abused, but I think in terms of this communal haunting, his work fits the bill beautifully. And the thing that kind of links all of his haunted people or all of his supernatural occurrences in his work are the fact that they connect with pariahs in the community. So if someone is haunted or there's a ghost visiting someone, one of those individuals has been ejected from the community. One of those individuals is an outsider. And so I think that he's doing something quite specific there that I'll address when we talk about him in the second half of everything. So I think I've given enough background, hopefully, where I can just jump right into Trewethey because I want to give her due attention. I think that her work is so complex. I will try to neatly frame it best as possible, although you could go off on many tangents with Trewethey. So I want to give an overview of, with Trewethey, I'm going to be talking about two categories of her poems in terms of Southern Gothic. One category is her Ecrastic poems. So she has a number of works in her volumes where she's describing paintings, and I'm using Ecrastic to also talk about photographs. She loves to talk about the figures, the bodies in these frames, to give insight into what's going on outside of the photographic frame. And I would say that's where her haunted knowledge is very much coming into play. She's trying to put to words what these bodies are showing us and give voice to these long dead people. The second category of her poems that I think is so important to her Southern Gothic aesthetic is I call them the mother poems. She mentions her mother heavily in every volume of her work, and it's important to know her mother was murdered. And so when Trewethey talks about her mother, it is in terms of very often the violence done to her. So exactly what happened to her at the hands of Trewethey's stepfather. But she also does have poems where she gives a sense of what her mother was like as a person outside of being a victim of violence. So I think she's trying to show that there is this fragmented view of life that we can have when we see a domestic violence victim, but there's also more to it that we need to try to retrieve. So 2 categories of poems, ekphrastic and mother. And I'll start with the ekphrastic that I happen to pick all medically centered things, it seems like, for today. So if that would be all right with you, Sam, if you wouldn't mind showing that first piece, I'll talk about what poem is being addressed here. So if you see this chalk drawing here, this was the inspiration for one of 3 poems in Trewethey's volume titled Thrall. Thrall, of course, can refer to water, but it also can refer to being enslaved under someone's control. And I would argue that her ekphrastic works in Thrall are definitely about, namely, people being enslaved by scientific ideology, medical ideology, that would use bodies for these purposes and use bodies as this kind of means to an end. So this chalk drawing that you see here is the subject of Trewethey's poem titled Knowledge. So the title of the drawing, it's from 1864, and it's by J.H. Hasselhorst, is titled The Dissection of a Young, Beautiful Woman, directed by J.C.H.G. Lucet, in order to determine the ideal female proportion. Every time I say that title, I cringe because what a purpose as far as, dissecting a body to determine the ideal female proportion. So to give you a sense of what's going on in this chalk drawing, you have this corpse. It's a young drowned woman who is on top of the examination table. She's nude except for that drape that's between her calves and thighs. And you have 2 men who are anatomists hovering over her. And you can see they have cut a flap of skin at her right breast. So the anatomical dissection is underway. And we have 2 men in the background who presumably anatomists as well, or for some reason they feel like they should be part of this autopsy. And I'll talk about some of we have these light symbols and books and things of that nature going on here that I think are strongly symbolic. So we have this young woman that Trewethey is describing in a particular way in the poem. And I want to address how Trewethey does talk about her, how she approaches an ekphrastic poem. She first looks to understand how she is subjectively responding to the painting or the photograph. And she uses that to create her description. And then, as I'll discuss momentarily, she ties that into her personal experiences that tie into the painting or picture, then how that ties into the crises of a community. So she starts off in her poem entitled Knowledge, saying that the young woman came to us like this, lips parted, long hair spilling from the table like water from a pitcher, nipples drawn out for inspection. And she says that the artist's depiction of the woman foreshadows the object she'll become, which we can imagine the skeleton's going to be put on display, the skull will be in some way, and then the bones will be used for study down the line. So Trewethey immediately focuses on this idea that the woman's body, although a dead body, is being sexualized. There's something that feels romanticized by the artist and perhaps by the purpose of the anatomists here. So the drawing's title, again, I cringe when I hear it. It's to determine the ideal female form. It reinforces this idea that the body, this cut body, this Gothic body, is being used in an objectified way. And it's a dubious goal, arguably. They're not trying to find a cure for anything. They're wanting to see what measurements are most appropriate for a woman's body. And in the poem, Trewethey later on says that anatomists would justify their work saying they were acting in the service of beauty to know it. However, them parsing the woman's body in this way, it kind of underpins these lofty goals. So they're using her as this object, and there's a note in there that basically says whoever this woman is. They have she's someone just pulled from the water. So they don't really care about who she was as a human. How can she help them achieve their goals? Trewethey refers to this woman as a young and beautiful and drowned Venus de Medici. And since no one knows her name, she throws out she could be named Mary or Catherine or Elizabeth, but ultimately argues that this name, whatever her name is, will be translated to the words corpus, areola, vulva. So we're back to these body parts that have been unfortunately sexualized. And we also have the word corpus. So even if they knew her name, it's like this woman is this empty signifier that's going to be ultimately replaced with a catalog of her parts. So corpus being a body, but it's also a body of work and a collection of written texts. She's going to be written upon by this scientific and medical power structure. So we see here, if the poem had kind of ended with the description of this scene, I think we would just see Trewethey's implication that scientific knowledge has often abused bodies for its ends and has treated human beings as objects for, again, sometimes dubious ends. But she takes these bodies, these cut, injured, and we'll look at a couple of other examples later, to tie into her personal trauma. So it's important to note that Trewethey is biracial. This is the topic in many of her poems. Her mother was Black, her father's white, and she was born during a time in the American South when it was illegal to be married, to have interracial relationships, and so her birth was technically illegal. And this is definitely an aspect that appears in knowledge. So she jumps from talking about the what's going on in this piece, and she finishes out with this discussion of the symbolism of the objects in the room. So you have this pyramid of light that's over the woman's corpse, and you have the man who's dissecting her holding pincers and a scalpel. And then the man who is at her head has his fist down on books. So this pyramid of light is representing this Enlightenment era pursuit of absolute truth and knowledge through fixing and categorizing. How does her proportions fit with the proportions that should be, for the figure? And during this time period, fixing and categorizing would have been seen as a light in the darkness. The scalpel and the pincers represent this cold clinical pursuit of truth, and then that fist on top of the books is almost like a punch. I am right. I'm very confident in my rightness as this medical authority. So as she's moving away from this ekphrastic description, there's these few lines that seem to feel non-contextualized, where she says, "Yet how easily the anatomist's blade opens a place in me, like a curtain drawn upon a room in which each learned man is my father. And I hear again his words, I study my crossbreed child." Misnomer and taxonomy, the language of zoology. So we have this thrown in moment where she says that her father refers to her as a crossbreed, and obviously her being a biracial woman is deeply offensive, and it's coming from her father, which would compound the trauma of that. So I went to an interview with Trewethey where she talked about what exactly had happened here. Her father is a poet as well, and they would do readings together. And Oh, and also too, of course, if you're so inclined, if you want to maximize the other elements, you're welcome to pull this down. But I know it would be pulled back up momentarily. So, Sam, whatever you would prefer there, I want to make sure it's easy as can be with that, because these next images will come up momentarily, but that way we'll one at a time. So when she and her father would read poetry together, one of the poems that he likes to talk about was titled Her Swing. And it was about, Trewethey as a child on her swing. But in the middle of the poem, there is the line, I study my crossbreed child. So he's at these poetry readings with his biracial child, calling her a crossbreed in front of this audience, which you can imagine how horrifying that would feel. And so Trewethey says at that moment, she would feel like the Venus Hottentot on display, that creature that was sort of turning around in her otherness and indifference. So it's one thing, of course, for your society to say that you're different, you're other, but for your own father to do that, I think that impact would feel like being dissected on the table, like this young woman. And so she's putting her father here as this representative of enlightenment knowledge, and she's this dark other. And I think that it intertwines, here's the personal, the communal. We have many ways of oppressing and categorizing and fixing and dissecting people, and her putting these things together in such an interesting way is why I find her Ecrastic Poems just fascinating. The next couple that I'll just kind of briefly mention, because I do want to make sure and talk about her mother poems and give those the attention they deserve. She does as well in the volume Thrall have two other poems that are ekphrastic. One is titled Miracle of the Black Leg, and the other is titled The Americans. And I do have an image of the two art representations of Miracle of the Black Leg, if you are so inclined to put those up. And I do appreciate the help here, since my computer is non-cooperative when it comes to that. So Miracle of the Black Leg, Trewethey's poem is referring to this phenomenon, this idea of that there was a medical miracle where a white man who needed a leg was able to get one from a black man, and then the transplant was successful. It was a miracle. What ends up happening with these different artistic representations that date back to the 14th century is it ends up really putting the white person not only physically but in many ways above the black person, and it is implying that the black person who is the donor is disposable, is medically disposable, that if that leg is needed, what's important is that someone needs it, not that you're going to have to take this individual. So she talks extensively in this poem about various artistic representations of the miracle of the black leg, and whether the person who's the donor is in the picture or not, you have this sense of agony, of theft. And you see the person who's receiving the donation looks very peaceful. Everyone around is placid and trying to make sure that this person is healing up properly. No one cares at all about the crumpled man on the ground, or the black man or woman who's out of the frame, who has had a leg taken from them. So in thinking about using black bodies for these medical purposes, if you've read, of course, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, if you've thought about various medical experiments that in the US that have happened, she's addressing a worldwide cultural phenomenon of the medicalization of black bodies in this way. And I think that poem is particularly disturbing because this is pieces of art that have persisted for centuries. So that, and actually I think we're good with the images, so very much appreciate, thank you, and no black screen on my end. So The Americans is one last one that she talks about, a depiction of a doctor who is dissecting a white derelict man who was found, presumably frozen to death out from exposure. And he is using this man to test the knowledge that lazy white men and black men are physiologically the same. So I think you can imagine the implications of that. This doctor would probably say, oh, everyone's all the same underneath. But he is using his medical expertise, if we want to call it that, to kind of underlie and reinforce his racism. So with these three poems in Thrall, these ekphrastic poems, I think she's really focusing on how medicine and science has in many ways oppressed these bodies, and these vivid images of cutting legs, cutting breasts, really confront us with this idea. Definitely want to give some discussion to Trewethey's mother poems. Trewethey's mother is such a significant figure in her work, and actually that was a huge focus of my dissertation. It was Mothers in Southern Literature, so Trewethey had to be central there. And I mentioned that her mother, whose name was Gwendolyn Turnbow, was murdered by Trewethey's stepfather. He shot her after there had been years of physical and mental abuse. And Trewethey has poems where she mentions what people have said to her about her mother after her death. Oh, she didn't leave him, and your father wasn't that great either. Do you think that maybe she had some kind of sexual weakness? Or do you think that maybe she could have done better to get away from him? I mean, very deeply offensive things that would compound this trauma of the murdered mother. And one of her professors in college, when Trewethey was writing about the death of her mother, said, you need to unburden yourself of the death of your mother and just pour your heart out in the poems. And she talks about this in a poem titled Imperatives for Carrying On in the Aftermath. But later in the poem, I think this is the line that just says so much of what Trewethey is trying to do by portraying her mother here, what her sense of guilt and responsibility is. She quotes a saying that she learned from a Korean poet. One does not bury the mother's body in the ground, but in the chest. Or, like you, referring to Trewethey, you carry her corpse on your back. So we have this weighty burden, this need to tell the mother's story and to carry her along through this. So it's not just, oh, your mother was sexually weak. Oh, your mother was a victim. Your mother was this. I think she's wanting to use these violent images of what's happened to her mother to give this fuller portrait of who she was. And I think there's a lot of guilt and anger and lack and longing wrapped up in this that are extremely complicated. And I think I should have probably written 20 more pages in my dissertation on that. She does also say in another poem that's titled Letter to Inmate 271847, that's her stepfather, she says, everywhere I go, she is with me, my long dead mother. So this constant idea of the mother's presence is there. And she mentions her responsibility further in a poem titled Shooting Wild. And she starts this poem by giving the image of the stepfather's hand imprint on her mother's face when she first realized her mother was being abused, and then moves into the mother's death. By the end of the poem, Trewethey says, I can't recall her voice since she's been dead. No sound of her, no words she might have said. So it's her duty to give Gwendolyn this sense of a voice in this depiction of her body. And I think that there's something just so sad and horrifying about all of this, but still very necessary in Trewethey's work. One thing that is a constant that ties into the mother, but ties also into ideological violence, amputated limbs figure prominently. Of course, we talked about Miracle of the Black Leg, but there's another poem called Family Portrait, and it starts off in a slightly sweeter way than maybe some of Trewethey's other work. So Trewethey, as a child, her parents said, we've got a photographer coming to take our pictures. But here's the thing, because of course we all know little children like to stare. They tell her he does not have any legs. He'll be in a wheelchair. He does not have any legs. Don't stare at him. Don't make him feel uncomfortable. So there's this discussion about, the man being helped into the home. He takes the picture. Trewethey's on her best behavior and doesn't do the little kid thing of staring and saying odd things. But then at the end, she talks about how she saw the man sitting in his wheelchair, scratching the air where his legs would have been. And we know that as the phantom limb phenomenon. If you have amputated limb, there's that sense of it still being there, and it might itch, it might feel like a little tickle there, and that can persist for years after the amputation. She ties this into the absence of her mother, that she says that years after, she still itches for what's not there. And so there's a lot about these different bodies all tied together with the sense of loss. And one thing I can barely touch on because there's so much about these mother poems, there's a constant motif of the idea of a wound. And in psychoanalytic theory, that's the nature of human existence. We are, our loss and lack are who we are. We're always chasing something to fill that wound, to fill that hole in our very ego, in our essence. And so she has these constant elements about wounds in the body, wounds in nature, that represent how she feels about the loss of her mother. They never quite heal. They feel decayed. They feel like, she's just chasing after something that's never going to let that healing take place. So that motif comes up very often. A couple of poems I wanted to mention in particular where there's images of the violated body. The first one is What is Evidence? This is a poem that talks about, it gives a list of all of the things the police at the time didn't consider sufficient evidence to put the abusive stepfather in jail. And it's a list of bruises and injuries, and her teeth are knocked out. Gwendolyn's teeth are knocked out, so she has to have false teeth. But this was not sufficient for the police to intervene. I also think that she's using what is evidence as this idea of what makes up a life. Is it these parts of a body, these fragmented elements, the bad things that have been done to the body? How can we account for this totality of existence when the legacy that's left is of a violent death after a life filled with abuse? So some of the lines that she gives here really give this imagery of what's going on through her mother's life. She keeps starting everything with not, because none of these were sufficient to get the police to help Gwendolyn. It says, not the fleeting bruises she'd cover with makeup, a dark patch as if imprint of a scope she'd pressed her eye too close to, looking for a way out. And she then moves into talking about Gwendolyn having a quivering voice, false teeth, then talks about there's a restraining order, and then she closes with the evidence of Gwendolyn's grave. Was that enough to not only lock up the father, the stepfather, or would that be enough to chalk up to, what is this life that Gwendolyn has? So how do we take these violent fragments and put them together into something? How do we use it as proof of something? And I think that she is trying to put these pieces together and use this haunted language to speak for her mother, to say, yes, she was a victim, but there are these other elements going on here too. One of the most jarring poems as far as the violence done to the mother's body is Articulation. In this one, this was the first time that she gave vivid imagery on what had happened to her mother. Her mother had defensive wounds and had tried to block the shot from coming in, and the gunshot shattered her ring finger. Kind of a cruel irony there. Her wedding ring was there, it shattered that ring finger. And then there's a bullet hole in the middle of her head. And Trewethey depicts this, that these were the injuries that her mother suffered. But I think that she doesn't shy away from this because it feels initially, I think, exploitative. It feels like it's meant to make us withdraw in disgust. But I think that she's using this to say, we can't shrink from these things. We can't just say, oh, she was a battered woman. No, what did he do to her? He shot her in the head. He shattered her finger. He destroyed her. He stopped her thinking. He stopped her consciousness. And so it's, how can we keep these stories from being muted? Sometimes you have to use the confrontational approach, the Gothic approach here. One thing that I thought was interesting, though, I mentioned the wound element that's a recurring motif in her work. She closes this poem, Articulation, with her mother's wound bathing Trewethey in a glowing light, almost like blessing her, like a saint. And I think that with her doing this, she's trying to sort of say, my mother is blessing me, or is, or is saying, here, I'm passing this along to you in some way. You can be my voice. You can tell this story here. So the mother poems, they do run extremely dark, but there are some beautiful ones that Trewethey has that I don't have time necessarily to discuss, about when she's pregnant with Trewethey, the plans that she has for the baby, all those little motherly superstitions of eating, eat dirt and this will happen to your baby, or don't do this will happen to your baby. So there's some very sweet poems as well that mix in with these elements of violence done to the body. To kind of wrap up a little bit of Trewethey, I do want to mention some of the other Southern Gothic elements that are so strongly seen in her work. And this is why I can't recommend her enough. Every time you read her pieces, you'll see something new. And I think I could write on her for decades and still not scratch the surface. So with thinking about her Southern Gothic aesthetic, she talks heavily, I mentioned the Ecrastic poems, the mother poems, but one thing that's key to her work, as well as natural disasters, particularly Hurricane Katrina. And her family is from the Gulf Coast. So she has a beautiful work called Beyond Katrina that's a meditation about this destruction. And there's a lot of heavily Southern Gothic elements depicting how the hurricane destroyed graves, covered up graves. So it's almost like it rewrote over the stories of the dead. And how do we try to put all these things back together? How do we get these voices in place? Obviously, people lost their lives in Katrina, properties were destroyed. You've got injury, sickness coming from this. And she's really portraying that as this is a sociological, political, economic sickness that we need to deal with. So the Gothic, I think, is used to great effect there. Lots of graves, lots of injuries, things of that nature. And then I mentioned briefly that she likes to talk about people whose stories have been often lost. So, and people who, in particular, their bodies have bore the burden of their work. So sharecropping farmers whose backs are really bent. You've got people who were, slaves who were picking cotton, forced to pick cotton, and the horribly degrading effects on their bodies. You've got people who are whipped, people who are sick because they don't have access to proper care because of poverty. I mean, she really does embrace this idea of what is wrong with the body shows what is wrong with society. And I think that that's such an important thread in her work. And I do recommend her highly in terms of who are these voices that are lost to history. And I think she gives them these full lives without idealizing them. So she's important for that. I think there are so many wonderful things to possibly say about Trewethey and how complicated her relationship is with the Gothic, but I would love to open this up for questions if people have any they would like to offer. So next, that takes us to Randall Keenan, and I think it's so unfortunate. He passed away. He's in his 50s, so a young man last year, and I think that there was so much more work possible from him. I did mention that he has been referred to as a Gothic writer, but I think that the depth of that has not been truly explored, and I think that there's just not enough scholarship on him, and his work is fascinating. And I think that now we're seeing like Jericho Brown, for example, who wrote the Tradition Pulitzer Prize winning collection of poetry. I think he owes a bit of a debt to Randall Keenan, because Kenan was the first one, I think, in the South to really openly, and obviously I need to give credit to James Baldwin as well for doing this, generally speaking, but he really put to the forefront, what is it like to grow up gay and Black in the South, especially in a small town. And Kenan's work has that as a consistent thread, particularly in his novel Visitation of Spirits. And I think that he's using the Gothic, as I mentioned, in more of the sense of the cultural haunting with Brogan that I talked about, although some of the bodies that we may mention could have some brutalizing. It's just not as blatant as what we see in Trewethey's work. So I want to start with to kind of set the tone for what Kenan is doing here. There's an epigraph from Let the Dead Bury Their Dead. And I'm focusing on two stories from this one. I'll give you the titles momentarily because one of them is a mouthful in particular. So Let the Dead Bury Their Dead is what we're focusing on. And we'll talk about two negative cultural hauntings, and I'll balance that out with two positive because the negative go to an extremely dark place, as you will see. So the epigraph to this collection of stories, it is a little bit lengthy, so bear with me, but I feel like it ties in really nicely here. It's a passage about dying from Catherine Ann Porter's novel, Pale Horse, Pale Rider. So the epigraph reads, granite walls, whirlpools, stars are things. None of them is death, nor the image of it. Death is death, said Miranda, and for the dead it has no attributes. Silence, she sank easily through deeps under deeps of darkness until she lay like a stone at the farthest bottom of life, knowing herself to be blind, deaf, speechless, no longer aware of the members of her own body, entirely withdrawn from all human concerns. There remained of her only a minute, fiercely burning particle of being that knew itself along, that relied upon nothing beyond itself for its strength, not susceptible to any appeal or inducement, being itself composed entirely of one single motive, the stubborn will to live. This fiery, motionless particle set itself unaided to resist destruction, to survive and to be its own madness of being, motiveless and planless beyond that one essential end. Trust me, the hard, unwinking, angry point of light said. Trust me, I stay. So in this passage, we have this hard, unwinking, angry point of light, this last vestige of life that's there, this part of us that wants to survive, even as everything else is shutting down. But I wanted to tie that into what's going on with this town, Timms Creek, this insular evangelical community in North Carolina that is the focus of Kenan's work. I would say this is the lingering memories of communal history and sometimes traumatic memories. This is a close-knit community in some cases. At least they all know each other well. They know who each other is. Their lines are drawn clearly between who's friends and who's enemies. And I think that when you have that kind of closeness, you share this collective history and collective traumas for that matter. So I feel like that hard, unblinking or hard, unwinking, angry point of light is kind of that residue of those things. It hangs on, it survives, and it is what binds them together in this cultural trauma, this cultural haunting. And we'll see some very disturbing representations of cultural haunting. I particularly like that section that says death is death, and for the dead it has no attributes. I feel like that kind of rings partially true for Kenan's work. So I think he is seeing death as a point on a continuum. That when we think about death, it is not the end of something. It is part of this non-teleological, non-chronological timeline that's part of all these cyclical life elements in general. So we'll never see him work in this chronological order of things. If you hear me jump around a bit and you hear these flashbacks and wonder where in the world I've taken you on this ride, I'll try to be very clear about that, because Kenan will go backwards and backwards and backwards and then forwards, 10 paces. So he resists these clear-cut timelines. And I think that is important, that, that death is not part of a chronology. The dead are kind of always with us. So the first story that I'm looking at is the first story in the work. And this is my favorite story of Kenan's, although it is dark in so many ways. It deals with, the ostracism of a child and his ultimate fate. So the story is titled Clarence and the Dead. And the subtitle is, And What Do They Tell You, Clarence? And the Dead Speak to Clarence. Kenan loves a long subtitle. So this story is all about a child who has supernatural knowledge. And it starts from, the story discusses his birth, his death and everything in between, and he has 5 short years of life. The title, if you read that in the subtitle in this order, it feels like it's in keeping with Kenan's lack of chronology and lack of teleology. So it's a cycle of sorts, like a call and response. So the dead are with Clarence. The townsfolk are asking him, what are the dead saying to you? And then the dead speak over and over again. So the dead speak. What are they saying? They keep speaking. And it's this cycle of communication and communing and haunting that is affecting this town of Thames Creek. I also thought that question in the subtitle comes across as confrontational. And I think when I talk about some of these characters later, that connection will be even clearer. And what do they tell you, Clarence, when he's talking with the dead? This idea of like, I need to know these mysteries that the dead are holding. And we'll discuss how these people are defensive when they find those answers. It's like a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. I like the indefinite pronoun in that title as well, they. I think that could relate to the dead, that could relate to the townspeople. And I think it just shows that there's not clear delineation between the living and the dead in Kenan's work, which makes him such an important Gothic writer. So we have this cyclical pattern, the cyclical tone that's set by the title, and the plot is consistent with that. We begin the story with Clarence's death on his 5th birthday due to flu and a weak heart. So we know immediately we're going to deal with the tragedy of a child that's dying. And it puts you in this surreal and supernatural place because the story says on the same day that Clarence died, the magical talking hog in the town stopped talking. So there was this hog that owned by a woman named Wilma that people would go visit because he would, sit around and say hello and how are you doing and all of these things. And he started talking years before, but Clarence's death made the pig, they're assuming there's a connection there, made the pig stop talking. So we get this already surreal, supernatural, a talking pig, a dying child. It seems just like an odd juxtaposition. This is a story that's also told by a member of the community. So we're kind of put in this position of treating Clarence like the community is going to be treating him. We're putting him in this position of an outsider. And I mentioned that Kenan is invested in talking about outsiders in his works, usually deviants who maybe they're gay, maybe they're poor, maybe they've committed adultery. They've done something that this evangelical community deems unforgivable, and they need to be either repairing or repenting for their sins and pulled back in the fold, or they need to be thrust from the community by any means possible. So we're put in this position of being in that community that would push out anyone who doesn't fit with its strict ideology. So even before, so we see Clarence is tied to the supernatural at the start of the story, but the community doesn't quite yet see that. But his birth is this really vivid, if we want to talk body horror, Kenan is presenting us with that at the start. And I think if to use Julia Kristeva's term, I think we're supposed to initially see Clarence as abject, because this is the scene that we get. His mother, Estelle, gives birth to Clarence with no assistance. She's pregnant, unmarried. The parents say, you've made your bed. This emerges in Faulkner as well. You give birth to this baby on your own and Lord help you. So she dies during childbirth, unfortunately, because there is no one there to assist her. After the townsfolk arrive to the scene, knowing a baby's been born, there's not a mother for this baby, they walk in, it says, quote, they walk in on one of the most hideous sights we can remember seeing or hearing tell of. Estelle, the mother, is dead in a pool of blood, her eyes rolled back in her head, while Clarence squeals on the floor, quote, in a soup of blood and purple mess and shit. So initially, people will have this visceral reaction to this infant. He's also covered almost completely in a caul, and they say it looks like mucus. And of course, there is the myth that a baby born covered in a caul, partially or fully, has the gift of second sight. So already these townspeople are suspicious. This is, this smacks of witchery, and then it's disgusting. They feel like they want to throw up. Because they don't want to see all these bodily fluids from birth. They don't want to see this corpse in this baby. So they're already pushing him away in that sense. They also mention the rumor that Clarence doesn't have a belly button, which is quickly dismissed, but it's brought up. And if you've read Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, one of the main characters, Pilate, doesn't have a belly button, and people think that she is a witch as a result. So I think there's some connections being made there between Clarence and this witchy woman that's treated with suspicion. Even though this narrator says, oh, this rumor is ridiculous, the narrator still brings it up, whoever this narrator happens to be. And so we keep getting these things like, I'm going to bring up something really offensive about this baby, about this child that the community feels as well. I'm going to pull it right back, but it's going to linger with you, that we are already creating this outsider status for Clarence. Clarence, as he continues to grow, he's being raised by his grandparents because there's no father in the picture. Of course, his mother has died, and he is nonverbal until 3 years old. This pushes him additionally apart. So we're talking about this taking place in early 80s in small town South, not words for what is possibly going on. So they're thinking that he is developmentally delayed, and they react in anger. However, at 3 years old, Clarence just starts speaking in full sentences, speaking to his grandparents like an adult, both relieving them and shocking them. It says that his words brings the end of peace to his grandparents' home. And the reason why this piece is ended is not the fact that he's a chatty child. I think that that's a pleasant thing to have in a house, but he is talking about things that he has no business knowing. There's a neighbor woman who walks by the house, and Clarence tells her that he has a message from her mother, a woman who was dead long before Clarence was born. And the grandfather can't figure out how Clarence knows this. So he, instead of thinking something else might be going on, he beats him for making up stories. So again, we're getting more and more pushing this child out, treating him as an outcast, treating him as a pariah. Every time some member of the community passes by, Clarence can't help himself. He's a 3-year-old. They like to say what's on their minds. And he'll say, oh, I saw your sister, I saw your brother. And these are all dead people. And he's giving these townsfolk messages from these dead people. And it scares some people so badly that they create a wide berth. They refuse to go by the grandparents' house anymore, which makes them ostracized from the community as well. So there's a lot of resentment toward Clarence because his weirdness, his supernaturalness, his haunting is ruining their status with the community. And apparently the community didn't find it problematic that they let their daughter die in childbirth, but that's a whole other area, I suppose, to go into. So the townspeople, it said that they feel sorry for the grandparents, but they're not feeling sorry enough to come in and say, hey, you're having a stressful time. Could we help in any way? So they're content to keep pushing these folks away. This doesn't stay in the same place for long. Clarence begins to escalate. And this is where he starts to exhibit knowledge of the darkest secrets of the town. This is where I think it veers into a negative haunting. And these ghosts are telling him this person sexually abused people. This person stole from family members. This person beat his wife. This person killed his sister to get her inheritance. I mean, some very dark things for, we're still talking about a child who's barely out of toddlerhood is hearing about these horrifying things that he probably doesn't even have a concept of. So he is sharing this with people, oh, so-and-so said, don't forget you have buried her in the yard. Or so-and-so said she still has bruises from the last time you beat her before you killed her. I mean, just these really horrifying things. And the narrator says, Clarence told people things a 4-year-old boy ain't had no business knowing the language for, much less a boy who could do well to stand and walk at the same time and refuse to give up his bottle. The narrator does, I keep talking about this, pushing Clarence away, objectifying him. This is a little child, and the community is treating him as though he is like an untouchable. We can't have contact with him because of these messages from the dead. So there's a lot of mention in the story from the townspeople about how he still drinks out of a bottle. But I would take that as that's a coping mechanism. He doesn't have any friends. His grandparents beat him every time he opens his mouth. The townsfolk are terrified of him, and the only people he can talk to are dead. And they're talking to him about things that he is too little to understand. I think any of us would want a bottle to soothe any in that case. So they're really treating him as this adult, and obviously this is a little boy, a very little boy that is dealing with some heavy adult things. So all he can figure out is probably, I'm bad, people think I'm bad, and they're not talking to me, and they don't want anything to do with me. After he is getting into those darker secrets, they push him out so much that, and this is a big deal in the community, he's not even invited to the birthday party for that talking hog I mentioned. Apparently that was the odd event of the year. Every year you go celebrate this hog's birthday, Clarence is not even invited to that. And that's kind of the, the kicker, the thing that shows that he is fully outside the community. To this point, he becomes so isolated, the townsfolk will walk in that wide berth by and just see Clarence sitting outside talking to people and animals that are not there. And it's like there's a complete, we would call this probably a complete psychosis, but he has been fully immersed in this negative haunting. His only companions are these ghosts. And again, a 4-year-old child is dealing with this. So he would have no knowledge how to escape this haunting. He wouldn't know about, how to walk away from this, how to eliminate this haunting from his life. These adults that we'll talk about later, they are capable of dealing with their hauntings, but he is a child and cannot. The biggest trigger point in the story comes when Clarence finds out from the ghost of a man that his grandfather had imprisoned on false charges. So his grandfather told a lie about a man, got him locked up. The man died in prison. And Clarence tells his grandfather, this man came to me and said something bad's going to happen to you. You need to pay for what you did to him. Well, grandfather dismisses it until the next day he loses his hand in a farming accident. And that is it, as far as the grandparents are concerned, as far as the community is concerned. Ministers and various religious communities in the town start calling to burn Clarence at the stake. They talk about, assaulting him and the grandparents. Again, small child here. And these are people who see themselves as, quote, good, commonsensical, level-headed, church-going folk. And this supernatural stuff is a bunch of nonsense, but it is their duty to burn it out of their community. There's a few people, though, who feel like, oh, this is great. It's not that Clarence is immoral. I can take advantage of this. So then there will be, as opposed to the group of people who want to burn this child to death, there are a group of people who will keep coming to the house and saying, tell me where this money is hidden, or tell me the winning numbers on this game. And so we've got this little boy who is being expected to give people what they want in that sense. And these opportunists are upset when things don't go as they want. So one woman, for example, wants to talk to Clarence about, she's like, you need to tell me how I die. When he does, she's not happy about that. And one man brings a ghost into his house after Clarence tells him how to find some family money. So there's consequences to this opportunism that they are subjecting this child to. After all of this boiling conflict, this exclusion of the child from the community, Clarence, when he turns 5, dies from a weak heart and flu combination. No one had known he had a weak heart. Quite frankly, it didn't seem like his grandparents cared enough to have him be checked up on, taken to the doctor. So probably something highly preventable here, but he was ignored. And what is the most horrifying of this story, when Clarence dies, the majority of the community just goes back to normal. And the narrator says, life in Timms Creek goes on as normal. Folk go on propagating, copulating, and castigating. Folk love, folk hate, folk debauch, get lonely and die, and they never speak of Clarence again. So this little boy dies after all of this conflict, and they just brush it under the rug. And this is a common element in Kenan's work, and that's where there's this dark thread that comes in. And I think his experience with, again, being a Black gay man growing up in small town South decades ago comes into play here. If you ever read A Visitation of Spirits, that's the nature of this book. And when something bad happens to the main character there too, everybody goes back to normal. It's the idea is once you have purged this outsider from your community, things are good. The community can regain equilibrium. And I think it's not the happiest message, but maybe it's unfortunately a realistic one for many of these insular communities. We are going to go, unfortunately, a little darker, although this is a deeply moving and important story. I think it's titled Tell Me, Tell Me. And I promise I will close off with positive hauntings that I think are a little, I think Kenan would appreciate that. So the story titled Tell Me, Tell Me focuses on a character named Ida. She is early 60s, white, the widow of a prominent judge in Thames Creek. And she was sort of known all over town as the representation of this powerful family. And so she's invited to all these things with the mayor and the governor, and she moves in these great circles. So she is the one who's haunted. She's not the outsider here, but we'll talk about who is haunting her, he being the outsider. And I think the thread that runs through these two hauntings, of course, is that we tend to see people as disposable. And I think Ida is very much guilty of that. And this takes a racialized violence turn. So the story begins with Ida frantically calling a friend of hers named Bella and saying, "He's in my room again." She has continuously seen this figure of a little black boy in her bedroom night after night. And she thinks it's a person. Spoiler alert, he's a ghost. When we will talk about how he's appearing in various ways. But she's seeing him night after night, and she's thinking this is a little boy who's trespassing on her property, and she doesn't really know what to do. How do you remove this child? Who do you call? Is this a police matter? What have you? Her friends tell her, "We think you've eaten some bad oysters. There is no little child in your room. You need to stop talking about this, or you will get put away by your children for senility, and you don't want that." This all seems to keep moving along in a particular way until one day Ida is driving with that same friend Bella in the car, and she sees the little boy in the middle of a road. She is certain at the speed that she's driving that she has hit and killed this little boy, and she's so upset in the moment that she drives into a tree. Bella is injured, Ida's okay, but both very shaken up. When she tells the first responders who show up, she's sick to her stomach over this, or she says she's sick to her stomach. And she says, "Please tell me where this little boy is. I've killed him, haven't I? Please look for him." There's no trace of any little boy. There's no trace that anyone was injured, hit, killed, anything. So she is encouraging them to go search for this little boy. So when we see this, we're like, oh, well, Ida's a good citizen. She wants to make sure that she did not commit a hit and run. And it talks about how her husband, this upstanding judge, that was his big thing. His big platform was hit and runs. Nothing was worse to him in the world than someone who would hit anything, be it a human, dog, what have you, property, and leave the scene. So she's very much influenced by this. This influence of the husband is going to be a very important thing later on in the story. When she talks about the little boy that she saw in the middle of the road, she said in her mind's eye, she could see the placid look on his face as if he recognized her. So we're getting this spookiness, this sense of being known by someone that she doesn't know. And it starts to build up where Ida then realizes from this wreck incident, I've seen this child before. So she is the type who constantly brushes things out of her mind. Troublesome things, she moves on. She forgets and keeps it going. But she starts to remember that there were 4 instances before this wreck where she saw this little boy. The first one was at a charity event. And this scene is set in a very posh way. Ida's there with the mayor's wife and the governor's wife and the senator's wives. And they're in this beautiful setting, eating wonderful food and drinking wine. And she says as she's sitting in there, she's thinking to herself, boy, I have really earned this. I'm marrying my husband. I have earned this comfortable life, this beautiful life. I am so deserving. And then she feels a pinprick. It says nowhere on her person exactly, but somewhere within, a bad feeling, a moment of disquiet in her hard-won quietude. So across the street, it's pouring rain, mind you, at the time. Across the street, out in the open, in the rain, she sees that little boy. And he is barefoot. He is getting rained upon. And there's a contrast that the narrator gives between the two. It says, Ida, warm, dry, richly fed, impressively dressed, and comfortable, became unaccountably angry with the boy. Probably cold, definitely wet, unshod black, staring at her. She just feels affronted and accused in this really indeterminate way. And she's upset that this boy is disrupting her moment of peace, the things that she's earned over time. So she topples her glass and spills it on one of the ladies at her table. But then the story mentions afterward, that's all she remembers of that day. She forgets for a while that it was the little boy that caused her to topple the glass. She's more worried that she looked bad spilling a glass of wine. That's her focus. She's not a character of depth, as we will be discussing with some other instances. Her second and third instance of seeing this little boy are at the mall and the beauty parlor. And the quotation about those scenes say, at the time, she felt annoyed, angered, invaded. But within moments of seeing him and reacting, something or someone would come between them and he would be instantly forgotten. So she has these moments of feeling just stared at, accused, confronted. And then as soon as she goes in the beauty shop or as soon as she starts shopping, this child is forgotten. And I think that's quite important because we get this element throughout the story of Ida treating Black people as disposable, as forgettable, as objects. She has a man who works for her, has worked for her for 25 years, named Joe. And he has helped her go look for this little boy when she thinks that this is a human being chasing her around, invading her home. But she reflects for a moment that she doesn't know who Joe's wife is. She doesn't know what Joe's favorite meal is. She doesn't know his favorite color. She has to think about what his last name is. And this is a man who's worked for her for 25 years. But as soon as she starts thinking, oh, I should know Joe better, or, oh, that little boy looks pitiful, she puts it right out of her mind because she doesn't want to deal with it. She does not see these individuals as subjects. The fourth time, the little boy is in her garden and she yells at him for trespassing and kind of chases after him. And there's this moment where he turns around and locks onto her with this accusing stare. And she just feels so disconcerted from this that she lets him walk away from her. So we have, all these moments of haunting that are coming up for Ida, and she's not really putting the dots together even after the wreck. So 4 instances of haunting, then the wreck, then he's coming into her bedroom, and she keeps forgetting each one of these things. And I think that feels quite abnormal. Any one of us, if we felt like we were being visited by a spirit multiple times, the same little child again and again, we might pay more attention. But again, she is part of this power structure that really doesn't regard so many people as human beings. This is tied into her husband. During his time on the bench, it mentions how Ida's husband was always upholding racial inequality. There are snippets of his conversations with people. There are snippets of court decisions that he made. And in all of them, he says things like, there's no use in giving equality to people on the basis of race, because he says Black people are not intellectually capable of using that responsibly. And so every time there's a snippet of his racist views, there's something about Ida forgetting this little boy. There's something about Ida ignoring the subjectivity of Joe. So we can tell she's complicit in all the things that her husband has done. She may not be part of the white male power structure, but she is part of a power structure, and she is upholding what her husband believes. And even to the extent of alienating her children. Her children have told her, this man, now that he's dead, we can safely say we hated our father. He was a bully. He was a racist. We don't want to be associated with him. We hate our very last name. And she will not speak to her children as a result of that. So she still upholds her husband's legacy, and he's been dead for years. Finally, I've been, of course, building up to this quite a bit. Who exactly is this little boy? And the reason I kept the suspense going is Kenan does the same thing. We get hit with the realization at the same time Ida does, because she keeps forgetting that this little boy is even a human being and exists. So we finally find out that this is a child that Ida's husband, Butch, murdered many years ago, this little boy. So what had happened when Ida and her husband were dating, they were on the beach with another couple, and Butch was pressuring Ida into having sex. So they were, in effect, there was some non-consensual sexual activity starting, and Butch began to yell and looked up and saw that this little boy had come upon them. And this was a time period, of course, when premarital sex would have been incredibly frowned upon. He also, obviously, as we have talked about, is incredibly racist individual and a horrible bully and a jerk. So instead of just leaving this be, he starts chasing this little boy and kicking him. The little boy, as anybody would do in that situation, kicks Butch, Ida's boyfriend at the time, in the crotch. This enrages him so much that he says, he grabs him up by the neck and says, "Let's see how far I can throw him." So it says, as the boy's chest convulses and sobs, his body makes a graceful arc, a dark parabola. And when he lands in the water, he splashes and screams until he drowns. So Ida standing there, the other couple standing there, as this child drowns and thrashes in this water. Ida recalls that Butch came out of the water looking triumphant. He looked the same as he did when he was in high school, scoring a touchdown at the football game. And instead of her saying something, what Ida does is she forces, quote, forces herself to smile. No, not forces, wills, creates, manufactures a smile. It's not enough for her to, in her opinion, stay quiet. She wants her future husband to see that she approves of his behavior. And I would say that is her whole problem. She has upheld what he represents, that she is that. I think that she's the type of woman who would say, "I'm not racist. I have this Black employee," or something horrifying along those lines. But as we can see, Ida is definitely as racist as her husband. She just didn't have judicial power to exert over people. What is particularly horrifying about the end of the story is when Ida finally has that light bulb come on, and she says, "Oh, I know who this boy was. This was the child that my future husband, or that my late husband, murdered." We're all sitting here as readers, shocked, of course, and horrified at this. She, it says, wipes that thought from her mind like wiping mucus from her nose, and steps inside and about her daily life. So she decides to brush off this little boy's murder, just as she has brushed off any sense of seeing Black people at all as humans. And I think the truly dark aspect of this, though, is we know it's going to continue in this way. Her husband died. He would never have been caught for this. No one ever reported this little boy missing. No one ever went looking for him. No one ever talked about pulling a body out of the water. It was like he never existed, and his murder further erased him. And Ida's complicit in it, but she's going to stay quiet, and she will be fine the rest of her life, at least in the legal system. And she's trying to be okay psychologically. But it's this continuum that Kenan has where once the outsider is gotten rid of, people move on with their lives. At the very end, it says, Ida had not cared to remember, not to remain innocent, not to remain free, not to spare herself worry, but because she simply did not care. And I think that sums up, unfortunately, the attitude that the community can have toward these people they deem as deviant, as outsiders, as unworthy of attention. So I know I took you to a very dark place with those two stories. They're worth reading. Clearance and the Dead, and then Tell Me are incredible stories. But I think in terms of balance, I'm going to give you two examples of positive hauntings in Let the Dead Bury Their Dead. One of them is a sexually positive haunting. So I think Kenan wanted to create balance in many senses. So the story I'll talk about is the next to last one, is titled "What Are Days?" ? What are days? This is the story of a widow, Lena, and widows figure very prominently in Kenan's work. They tend to dwell on the sins of their husband. They tend to feel very mired in the past, and Lena's no exception. Her husband was this bigger than life, boisterous, kind of bullying guy, drank a lot, busted up bars with the boys and cheated on her. And he was one of those, like a mythological figure, and everybody loved him. So if she complained about him, they would say, "Oh, that's just," and the guy's name is Cannonball, which is fitting. "Oh, that's just Cannonball. You need to leave him be and let him be a man. This is who he is." So in her widowhood, and she's a young widow at 51 years old, she is sitting there thinking of all the things that went wrong in this relationship. And one day, though, she gets a knock on the door, and it's a very handsome 19-year-old young man. And he claims to be the newest neighbor's son. And he wants to, help out with yard work and things like that. Well, then he starts talking with her and telling her how attractive she is. And there's no way she's 51 and all of these types of things. And one thing leads to another, and this young, very handsome man becomes Lena's lover for the weekend. He stays over. There's lots of vivid descriptions of bubble baths and how much he's worshiping her body. And she is sitting there previously thinking, "Oh, my husband hated my body. He cheated on me. He said I had, a large butt and looked horrible." And meanwhile, this 19-year-old is saying, "You're the most incredible person I've ever seen. I want to worship you right now." So they have this sexually fueled weekend where they basically never either get out of the bath or the bed. And Monday morning comes, and this young man, who tells her his name is Shang, says, "I've got to be on my way." And he looks very panicked. So she thinks maybe he'll come back later, but ultimately 20 days pass with no sign of this young man again. And so she becomes in that phase of starting to be negatively haunted. Where did he go? I can't believe that he would do this to me. I guess ghosting someone would apply here very much to that turn of phrase. So she's very angry about this. And she thinks, you know what, I'm just going to go to the neighbor's house, new neighbor's house, and just ask him why. Why did he abandon me? She goes to this house, and just like the horror movie tropes or horror story tropes of many, many years, the person who answers the door and says his name is Shang is not the same young man that she had there for the weekend. So this man that she had at her home, this lover of hers, no origins, can't be found. No one knows who in the world she's talking about. He might as well be invisible. But the positive note is, after she realizes that she has had a very interesting haunting over a weekend, she takes that as a way of reconciling her past and present. She thinks, my husband did cheat on me. He was kind of a jerk. I loved him, but also thought he was a jerk. And, he made me feel bad about the way I looked and the way I presented myself. But this young man thought I was it, like everything. So I'm going to see myself as that. I've got a new phase in life. I'm not just Cannonball's widow. I am Lena. I am moving forward, and I'm going to be proud of where the next years take me. So we have this, this is positive haunting on all counts. And no sense of trauma is remaining here, it seems like. And I think there's definitely an emphasis on not dwelling on the past in these unhealthy ways. Deal with it and move on as far as this haunting is concerned. The last one is titled Things of This World, or Angels Unawares. And our main character there, his name is John Edgar Stokes. And he goes out to his yard, and this is an 86-year-old man. It's important to the story that he's a Black man too. he goes out to his yard one morning and finds a man lying face down. And the man, I think you can sort of see where this might be going, is mumbling, "I've fallen, I've fallen." Maybe from a very high place he has fallen. We'll see. So John Edgar rolls this man over, and this is an Asian man there would be no Asian people at this time in Timms Creek. Black or white were the divisions. So John Edgar decides this is a man from China. He's a migrant worker. He got roughed up at a bar, and now he's face down in my yard. But the man won't let John Edgar call the police. And he just basically says, "Can I, stay at your place for a while?" John Edgar lets this man stay. The man tells him his name is Chi. And John Edgar has been alone for decades. He never got married. He missed his chance, he says, didn't have children, doesn't have maybe a couple of close friends. And Chi kind of fills this void for him. John Edgar has someone to cook for, and he has someone to talk about all of his great memories of his youth with, because Chi is just kind of sitting there as, yeah, talk away. Whatever food you eat, I will love. And is just this sympathetic ear for him. The story does take a turn when John Edgar has apparently had a long-standing feud with the town racist, Mr. Terrell. And Terrell is always threatening to shoot John Edgar's dog, his baby. And he does just that in the story. He claims that the dog is trespassing. The dog is, a health hazard because he's used the restroom in his yard and these types of things. So when John Edgar finds out that Terrell has killed his dog, this switch gets flipped. And as Chi is standing there with him, he loads up his gun, goes to the Terrell's business. They have a general store, happened to have one of their dogs there. He not only points his gun at the Terrell's sons, but he kills one of the Terrell's dogs. The whole time Chi is there standing by. I think we can imagine this would have been, decades ago, small town South, and we can imagine that the justice system would not be kind to John Edgar here because he is a black man, Terrell is a white man. John Edgar knows a lynching is coming. The sheriff is on Terrell's payroll and comes out to get him. Thankfully, Chi, the local minister, and a few local doctors, all black, obviously, with the exception of Chi, managed to hold off the sheriff and hold off the mob. And then the local minister, pays John Edgar's bond, but he knows that clock is ticking. We all know that's hanging over his head. This Terrell is not going to let this lie. John Edgar is going to be murdered for shooting this dog. So as John Edgar, as the night wears on, sits in his home with Chi, he says, everybody's gone now. I'm so sorry I shot that dog, but what would be the best revenge is if I died tonight in my sleep peacefully. I'm 86, I've had a great life, and Terrell can't get to me, and that will frustrate him until the day he dies, that he had no control over my life in that way. So the story ends with John Edgar goes to sleep and never wakes up, and no one ever sees Chi again. So in this case, the haunting we have, John Edgar is able to go out on his terms, not give Terrell the satisfaction of getting to brutally murder him, and knowing that he is going to, in effect, haunt Terrell for the rest of Terrell's life. So that is, again, a positive haunting. Obviously, we have the death of John Edgar, but he sought it. He felt at peace with it. So I think we can see Chi as this, angel representation, and Lena's angel coming in a very different fashion there too. So I do want to include some of these positive hauntings from Kenan, because I think that there are some deeply dark threads that run through his works. There's communions with demons when people feel so outsider status and scapegoated. There are, people being beaten and people being mistreated. But there's also these people who are just relishing life and knowing that, again, it's one point on a continuum. So I wanted to close on that happier note with, don't give people the satisfaction in that case. So I know, because I started this one a little early, this time I didn't have any tech issues, so we're running a little ahead of time. And again, if there's any questions, I would love to answer them.